Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for invitation and for the introduction. I will go straight into the subject. Between riot and pogrom, anti-Jewish violence in 19th century Germany. Talking on anti-Jewish violence in 19th century Germany, there are at least three clusters of action to take under closer investigation. The first one is a series of events in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, the so-called Hep riots. During late summer of 1819, the second cluster of violent attacks took place during a period of heavy social unrest around the revolutions of 1848. In comparison, the third cluster, located in the Prussian province of Pomerania in 1881, was more restricted and of specific regional character. However, within a broader perspective of international comparison, all these events do not seem to me of having been exceptional grave or extreme anti-Jewish violence. Of course, it will remain a question of definition, whether we call those events riots or pogroms. For most of the cases that have to be discussed here, I would prefer the notion of riot, that is, collective violence from below, rather than pogrom, a term that should be reserved only for extreme cases of exclusionary violence aiming at expulsion or even annihilation of the attacked ethnic and minority outgroup. My first point, I talk on Hep riots of 1819. 4 years after the Congress of Vienna and only 2 years after a severe food and hunger crisis, 1816 to 17, in many parts of the country, a wave of anti-Jewish violence spread over many states of the Deutsche Bund, covering some 30 sites of open conflict, predominantly in southern and western German regions of Baden, Württemberg, Franconia, Hesse, and Rhineland, but also in some genuine Protestant regions in the north, like the city of Hamburg or in the eastern Prussian provinces. One has to throw a closer look on the initiating and prominent outburst in the Bavarian town of Würzburg in Lower Franconia. During 3 or 4 days at the beginning of August 1819, large crowds gathered on the streets shouting Hep, the somehow ominous battle cry of anti-Jewish action, smashing windows of Jewish-owned houses, destroying the signboards of Jewish shops and pillaging several of those shops as well as private houses. Most of the Jewish inhabitants fled the town. When military and police finally had restored order, 2 persons, 1 rioter and 1 soldier, had lost their lives. Why was it just Würzburg? Why in the year 1819? And who were the rioters? Not surprisingly, the crowd in Würzburg, as elsewhere, was composed of the lower orders, rough people who who used to participate in collective violence. One local citizen and innkeeper is mentioned, a weaver, a painter, some shoemaker, day laborer, carpenter, hat maker, apprentices, and the like. It seems noteworthy to state here that neither in Würzburg, home of a traditional but small university, nor elsewhere, students participated in violent anti-Jewish action. At the beginning of the 19th century, the former Hochstift Würzburg became secularized and, from 1815 on, part of the Bavarian kingdom. Since 1803, Jews who had been absent from Würzburg since the 17th century were allowed to settle anew in the town. By 1819, the Jewish community had grown to some 400 persons in a town of 20,000 inhabitants. By an edict of emancipation, the Bavarian state had granted political and juridical or legal equality to the Jews. There's much evidence that the fast-growing Jewish community in the town, with its bankers, money lenders, many tradesmen and shopkeepers, was met with resistance, anger, envy of large parts of the resident Christian inhabitants. A controversial debate in newspapers and by pamphlets between foes and friends of Jewish emancipation in the town during the months preceding August 1819 reflects a sharp political and mental division among the Würzburgers. The celebrated return of a town's delegate from a session of the Bavarian Diet in Munich, where among other issues the future of the Jewish emancipation had been debated, gave the initial start for heavy outbreaks of anti-Jewish resentments and action. Since weeks, anti-Semitic rumors, letters, and placards fluttered through the town. There can be no doubt that a large majority of the townspeople would have voted against a complete political and juridical equality, in German Gleichstellung, of the Jews. The riot itself then can be considered as an act of violent street politics from below, which surely had a larger spiritual and political backing from some middle and upper class supporters. Notwithstanding a great variety of violent events within the Heb riots of 1819, the case of Würzburg can be looked upon as an anti-Jewish action pars pro toto of that time. It was a heavy outburst against full emancipation of the Jews and its perceived economic, social, and political consequences. The underlying and broader motivational framing was made up of a crude mixture of traditional Christian anti-Judaist rumors and beliefs, as well as very concrete contemporary political aims and social economic demands against a local group of religious and ethnic outsiders. Without question, heavy impacts of a widespread anti-Semitic academic discourse during the stressful decade of fundamental change, 1810 to 20, a disturbing time of wars, economic crisis, and political reform, and the circulation of more popular newspaper articles and pamphlets have to be considered. A rough outcome of those heated and resentful aspirations were popular posters and flyers that often preceded and accompanied many of the violent outbreaks. For instance, during the Hamburg riots, slogans like the following were distributed in the streets. Hep, der Jude muss in Dreck. This means circa, hep, Jews into the dirt, or hep, Jude verreck. Hep, this would mean hep, may the Jews perish. So I go forward to the next, to my second point, anti-Jewish rioting during the Revolution of 1848. At no other time in 19th-century German history, collective violence was as widespread as during the severe crisis years around 1848. And within this unrest, anti-Jewish riots occupied a considerable part. A strong anti-Jewish component could be discovered already within many of the food riots of springtime 1847. In Landsberg an der Warthe, this is Prussian province of Brandenburg, in April 47, for instance, the Jewish landowner Louis Boas, who had been buying up potato stock for his distillery, stood in the center of violent attacks by the working poor. Bitter complaints were expressed about the Jews as corn profiteers, forestallers, grain speculators, and the like. The mechanism of Edward P. Thompson's moral economy worked, and violent crowd action then was more probable if landowners, corn dealers, shopkeepers, etc., were Jewish. In March and April 48, during the first and extreme unruly weeks of the revolution, anti-Jewish attacks were most prominent, especially in the agrarian and still more or less feudal regions of the southwest. For the Grand Duchy of Baden alone, some 34 incidents have been documented, often intertwined with anti-feudal actions against mania lords. Threatening letters were at stake before and during the uproar, like this one addressed to the synagogue official in Krautheim, Baden. The letter goes like this. Julherrsch Rothschild, after work, gather together the Jews and tell them if they do not leave Krautheim in 3 days, then on the 4th day, all those who are still there will be hung and Krautheim will be burned to the ground. I have spoken, and mark my words. This is what you see on the letter. However, no action occurred in Krautheim. A comparatively well documentation is available for the northern Baden small community of Unterschöpf, where violence broke out on March 8. 7 Jewish houses were demolished and plundered. Numerous promissory notes were stolen. Local militia did not interfere. The main slogan of the rioters is reported as "Freedom lives, one religion, one God, and one ruler." As a whole, one finds three major motives in the anti-Jewish assaults of the Southwest. There was, first, the old tradition of Christian anti-Judaism, a more or less ubiquitous religious mentality, reinforced then through rumors, letters, pamphlets, sermons. Secondly, there was the widespread denouncing of Jews as usurers and hagglers, certainly some reflection of the participation of Jews in the poorly developed credit system on the countryside. Finally, people resisted to the full emancipation, which meant they opposed Jews becoming citizens with equal rights in their communities. In some places, local Jews were forced to sign documents renouncing their share of equal communal rights, including poverty aid. In comparison to the Hep riots of 1819, anti-Jewish violence around 1848 was more a phenomenon of the countryside and small towns, predominantly in Baden, Württemberg, Hesse, and Bavaria, where tiny Jewish communities in village and country towns were afflicted most often. In larger cities, under the more liberal democratic conditions of the revolution, anti-Jewish violence hardly gained support. Only in some eastern cities of the Habsburg monarchy, including Prague, Bratislava, Pressburg, and Budapest, anti-Jewish riots took a larger role within the revolutionary unrest. Within a long-term history of Jewish-Christian relations in Germany, the revolutionary years represent a contradictory experience for Jews. Hope and fear intensified at the same time. There were, on the one hand, prospects for complete emancipation through general liberal legislation, and, on the other hand, newly intensified persecutions through violent crowd assaults from the streets. Now my third point, more short, anti-Jewish violence after mid-century. As far as we know today, there was only one larger cluster of anti-Jewish violence during the second half of the 19th century. In the summer of 1881, anti-Jewish riots spread through Pomerania, starting in the district town of Neustettin. In some 15 to 20 towns and villages, demonstrators marched through the streets shouting the old catchword "Hep, Hep," or slogans like "Jews to Palestine." People smashed windows and Jewish-owned stores and synagogues. Social tensions and frustrations, anti-Semitic propaganda, and some ambivalent behavior of the government were general causes in the background of the unrest. More obvious than in those cases discussed here before, crude anti-Semitic agitation, party fights between Christian conservatives and liberal Democrats, and newspaper articles on that issue played its role before and during the riots. In this context, the radical Berlin anti-Semitic leader Ernst Henrici has to be mentioned. This is probably Adolf Stöcker, another one, it's not Henrici. He has to be mentioned then as a 27 years old former secondary school teacher who was preaching hardcore anti-Semitism in public lectures throughout the country. In February 1881, he held one of his inflammatory speeches in Neustädtin. 5 days later, the local synagogue went up in flames. Only shortly before the riots in June 81, he undertook a second trip through Pomerania and West Prussia, heating anti-Jewish resentment and emotions in the whole region. I come now to very short concluding remarks. To begin with the Nazi seizure of power and the Holocaust, there is no straight way forward from the 19th century anti-Jewish violence in Germany to the Crystal Night of 1938 and the gas chambers of Auschwitz. Many further steps in between had still to happen and have to be considered. If we evaluate the violence against Jews in Germany until the beginning of the 20th century in a comparative perspective, its extent, form, and gravity does not point obviously to the singular catastrophe of the future. Heavy street violence was at stake in many kinds of crowd actions from below, at least until the middle of the century. And anti-Jewish violence then took almost always more the form of riot than heavy pogrom. However, there were a few incidents that bred out some kind of pogrom atmosphere, threatening Jewish communities not only with violence but with expulsion or even annihilation. Probably a more grave mortgage from later 19th century times for the future may have been the mushrooming of hardcore popular anti-Semitism propagated by such activists like Hermann Ahlwardt, Ernst Henrici, Wilhelm Marr, or Adolf Stöcker, to mention only a few. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Toby. Thank you for the invitation, and I look forward to our discussion. What I will present is overall indebted to the incredible research done by my predecessor at UCL, John Doyle Clear, whose research results I will be presenting here. John passed away in 2007, and I have been honored to publish his last monograph together with Dr. Fisher and Helen Clear, on which much of what I will discuss today will be drawn. This monograph is entitled Jews, Russians, and the Pogroms of 1881-82. Devoted to this very crucial moment in history when anti-Jewish violence became a highly politicized mass phenomenon in Russia. What I want to do is to present some of the trajectories of anti-Jewish violence in Eastern Europe and also open up space for discussion. I very strongly disagree with my predecessor in his definition or differentiation between riot and pogrom. I think these are very hapless attempts. Certainly not your research, but the attempt to distinguish between riot and pogrom is just a translatory problem of translating a Russian term into Western languages, but not making a lot of difference in the substance we are discussing. And I hope to make this point with a contrast between two sets of maps, which I will be showing in the course of my talk. So Eastern Europe, when I talk here to members of the Jewish community and I tell them that I'm working on Eastern Europe, the first answer I get, yes, pogroms. So Eastern Europe is very much identified with anti-Jewish violence, and with anti-Jewish violence of a very specific kind, a mass-based, broad violence. I would like to share with you one example for a smaller, what my predecessor would probably call a riot, an attack on a celebrating Jewish community in Warsaw in the year 1871. On the evening of Sukkot, cheery and even-minded Jewish families had sat down in their beautifully decorated huts as a mob of around 50 Christians assaulted them and beat and kicked men, women, and children. The head of police in this 9th district, we are speaking about Warsaw, the capital of Poland, angrily dismissed the complaint, claiming it to be a non-issue as nobody had been killed. The very next day, uncut youths attacked a Jewish funeral, but this time the perpetrators were arrested. The point which I will make in my short discussion here is that we can gain insights by trying to theorize anti-Jewish violence, and I will use a model which has been used not only by John Clear but also by experts like Paul Brass or Donald Horowitz or Senator Charles de la Roche, working on anti-African American violence in the United States, looking at the relationship between communities in order to understand why violence happens and how it happens. And why this first citation is so interesting is that this seems to be a manageable kind of violence in the sense, sorry for my very colloquial choice of words, for the fact that there is, as you can see, an instance here of appeal. There's somebody to turn to, namely the policeman or the head of police of the 9th district. He dismisses the case, or he accepts the case that this is something bad, or he says this is something not so bad. And I think the case of anti-Jewish violence in Pomerania in 1881 is extremely relevant in this context because if we compare the simultaneous anti-Jewish violence in Pomerania, which is, if you want, of a pogrom type, with what happens in Russia, the difference is not in the violence, the difference is not in the motivations and the acts. The difference is in the reaction of the government or the administration. Where when you have in Pomerania, once these riots occur, one soldier every 50 meters in these Pomeranian communities for 1 year, no further violences occur. If you look at the Russian Empire, which John Clear has in a fortuitous formula defined as a malpoliced state, there were no ways to control violence which would erupt in a way which I will illustrate using a map. So very important to understand the dynamic of violence is to understand how people do things and what keeps people doing from doing things. So let me share with you a map which you obviously cannot understand in detail, but this is southern eastern Tsarist Russia. This is actually exactly where the separatists today fight against the government in Kiev. And to look at the levels of history in this particular region of Europe is highly fascinating, but I won't go into the Ukrainian dimension of things. What you have here, and which you cannot, I have to explain it because it's too far away, too small. These are, each place on the map is a place of an anti-Jewish riot. And what we did for this map is to differentiate between the first, the second, and the third decade of the first wave of violence occurring in Russia after April 1881. So what you see is that there are dots all over the place, and it's very messy. It's not systematic. This is a map which you find in John Clear's monograph, by the way. You have in the cutout, the detail map is one example. We could just do one example of how violence would spread around a place, which is called Smela. These violence, it is impossible to establish how this violence spread, why it spread, to which places it spread. This was, to a large extent, spontaneous violence, which was directed against the Jews. Just to summarize things which you probably all know, that the violence in Russia broke out after the assassination of Alexander II in March 1881. A Tsar who was very, very highly valued. He was the liberator Tsar, and the distress in the population was considerable. In one place, Elisabethgrad, which is more or less there, a first riot breaks out after a tavern brawl, totally unpredictable, and spreads from there. And in the course of 1 year, around 400 incidents of anti-Jewish violence happen across this region. 400 riots or pogroms, I really don't care how you call it. In these 400 instances of anti-Jewish violence, around 20 Jews were killed. Also 20 rioters were killed, mostly by police or other forces of order. So if you do the simple arithmetics of this violence, you will see that the major energy of this rioting was not lethal. It was not attempted to kill. In the first place, it was not the prime objective of this violence to kill people, although people got killed. What is also very important to understand is that this violence occurred in a region which was not of long-standing Jewish settlement. Jews moved into these regions in the first decades of the 19th century. So it doesn't happen in Polish territories, it doesn't happen in Lithuanian territories where Jews would be living for 300, 400, 500 years. But these are territories which had been conquered from the Ottoman Empire in the late 18th century. This is relatively young Russian territory and a relatively young Jewish settlement. So you have a fluid situation of cohabitation of very diverse type. It is a period of massive immigration and massive economic change. To sum up, the main characteristics of this wave of violence, which is so iconic, also in Eastern European history as well as in Jewish history, perhaps more in Jewish history than in Eastern European history, is that it is normally understood as the first modern wave of anti-Jewish violence. It is an urban phenomenon, so the villages are spared from this violence. It happens in the towns. It is a phenomenon which found successor events. So, like in the place like Smela, for example, you have an anti-Jewish pogrom or riot happening. And then in all these places around Smela, you have anti-Jewish violence erupting. One factor, or the factor which made this violence modern, and I think we can actually link it to to anti-Jewish violence in German territories, for example, the Heb-Heb-Krawalle, is that they were spread through modern means of communication, especially the press, and the telegraph and the railroads. So the more modern communication gets, the faster the violence becomes. We can draw a straight line, I would say, from the telegraph in Russia and the railroads to La Radio des Collines in Rwanda in 1994, where the radio proved to be the most important organizer of a mass murder. What is very important to understand in the context of understanding the dynamic of the violence is, and here I already referred to the theoretical model I would like to introduce, the competitive ethnicity model, is that the government was perceived as passive, weak, and distant. So it is not the head of the 9th District Police. It is the faraway Tsar, and in this case, in a period the Tsar is killed, and the state is not there anywhere to be seen. So what we have is a situation of volatile social and economic situation in a relatively recent form of interethnic cohabitation, where a spark might suffice to trigger the violence. Again, as I said, in the case of these iconic events of 1881, 82, not extremely violent riots. One element which I think is very important to understand the general European pattern of anti-Jewish violence is that there's a learning curve. So places which had violence in 1881 would again have violence later or early in the 20th century, and there's a very distinct difference between places which had experienced anti-Jewish violence or where people had been involved in anti-Jewish violence, where the violences which would occur in the early 20th century would actually be much more violent than in other cases. So people learn to be brutal or learn to attack other people. And there are many, many examples for this. Ilzergrad, Kiev, Balta, Smela, Pereyaslav, and many others. So what is this competitive ethnicity model based on? So the first, it tries to identify the factors which actually facilitate the outbreak of interethnic violence. And the first factor I already mentioned, it is a perceived weakness and passivity of government in general. Police. Another factor, at least as important, probably more important. And this is really a factor in inter-ethnic violence wherever you look. You could also look at inter-Asian violence in Birmingham to prove this fact. Is that in the moment where a majority population in a given place, perceives a group, a minority or marginal group as overtaking, the risk of inter-ethnic violence rises dramatically. So a majority used to be in a superior position sees a dynamic minority group or group of marginalized group gaining in prominence, gaining in success, and raising the stakes of interethnic cohabitation. This is what is an ubiquitous phenomenon of interethnic violence, which was obviously the case in Tsarist Russia in this period of time. An additional factor which has been commented upon a lot is obviously the ideological reinforcements of stereotypes and prejudices which somehow frame the violence, because you need somebody to tell you that you are allowed to cross the red line. You can smash the window, you can hit a person, you can rob the property. So the people who do say that are those people which Paul Brass, in his really seminal pioneering introduction to his volumes, Riots and Pogroms, has called pogrom specialists. And I take issue with the identification of the pogrom perpetrators as lower classes. This doesn't work. The lower classes themselves are not attacking other people. If I would be, no, I don't want to sound, that sounds arrogant when I say they need somebody to tell them. But who are crucial in this process of triggering and allowing for violence are people who explain why it is just and correct to do it. So the teachers, the journalists, the priests, the administrators, the police people, the generals, they are telling you can cross the line. And then people will cross the line. And it is not important who is on the other side of the line, a Jew, a black person, or an Asian, and who is on this side of the line, a Russian, a Pole, or a Jew, or a Palestinian, to raise a couple of waves here. So this is all based on a model which is defined as relative deprivation theory. In the moment when you have a very clear shift in relations between larger groups of population, then the risk of violence raises, and it is all about governance. It is all about policing whether violence will happen or not. I would be just for the sake of a discussion, I would be very, very clear on that point. But obviously, the definition of these groups need to be culturally plausible. So the usurer, the Jewish usurer, for example, or the visible minority, or the whatever is usable in this context, is used to define the other as being the one who can be attacked or can be defined as a legitimate target of violence. What needs to be said for the violence in Russia in 1881-82 is that it was actually only to a very, very limited amount motivated and explained through religious concepts. In many cases, synagogues were not attacked in places where riots happened, and the slogans which were shouted was "Down with the Jews" or "Out with the Jews," but not "Out with the Christ murderers." Although we have in Eastern Europe a rich and deep current of blood libel accusation traditions, which would offer a lot of references here. This was not the case. Also, what was not the case in 1881-82, relatively few looting took place. So it was not in the sense of earning a lot of assets by robbing. I don't know what I have here. Okay, that's a bit later. We come back there. So what is extremely important is to understand the role of governance, of policing, and the understanding of the relationship between communities in a given commonwealth. Yes. So learning curve, I covered that. So what is the case is that the riots in 1881-82 were the beginning of a development which would lead to a more dramatic violence, most notably in Chisinau in 1903. In 1903 in Chisinau, Edward Judge has written about this, in 1 day or 2 days of rioting, as many in one place, one incident, as many people, no, more people got killed than in the 400 riots in 1881-82. This is why Chisinau is such an iconic event, because this is really something which goes in the direction of mass murder violence with a very strong impetus to actually destroy the other. The model of competitive ethnicity has this advantage to it, that it helps us understand that in these communities, Russia, Poland, Lithuania, Hungary, Romania, where you have very sizable Jewish populations, violences occurred, but the communities overall lived side by side in a rather unproblematic way. So these violence are like crystals of eruptions between communities, and here it is. This is a quite important dimension, because the pogrom, to define the pogrom as a type of event which strives to the annihilation, to the expulsion or the annihilation of a different community, is not correct if we really want to understand what the pogrom in Eastern Europe was. The pogrom, as I said, the pogroms in Russia in the 19th century are riots, as in Pomerania, or as they have riots, or riots in other places, in other times as well. I would very much insist on that. I don't know, how much time do I have?
A couple of minutes, if we could conclude.
Yes. To illustrate the way the central authorities understood the violence and why there is a disconnect between the central power in Tsarist Russia and these developments. I have a citation of Nicholas II, certainly not a Tsar liberator. To the contrary, he certainly didn't like the Jews. A whole mass of loyal poor people suddenly made their power felt, and he talks about mass violence against the Jews in the context of the revolution of 1905 and 1906. Thousands of people got killed. I mean, this was really massive violence. A whole mass of loyal people suddenly made their power felt, and because 9/10 of the troublemakers, revolutionaries, are Jews, the people's whole anger turned against them. That's how the pogroms happened. This is how a Tsar understands politics. Certainly, but in a certain way, a very good illustration of the point I wanted to make. Now, that's leading us astray. Now, my point for discussion for our debate later. I have a real issue with the use of the term pogrom. Pogrom just means riot. It's Russian for riot. Full stop. There's no different quality to the term. Why and how has this term been appropriated in Western historiography? This is something which I find very interesting, and we heard an example in the introduction to this event. The November pogrom. Okay, so let's assume what happened in 1938 was a pogrom. Let's look at the map. You remember the map from Russia, right? Messy dots all over the place over a period of 1 year. These are the German Jewish communities in the year 1932. Just have a look at the map. You have the corridor, which has been taken from Germany by the Nazi allies. Each green dot is a Jewish community. Now have a look at what happens in one night. This is one night. This is not a pogrom. This is terror. This is state terror. This can only happen by somebody picking up the phone in Berlin or in Munich and telling people what to do. And telling them what to do in one night, whom to target, what to do, burn down the synagogues, arrest the people, arrest the leaders, bring them to the concentration camp, all in one night. This has nothing to do with a pogrom, which doesn't mean that a pogrom is fun or not bad. A pogrom is very bad, but this is so much worse, because this is exactly what leads to Treblinka. And this is what I would like to propose for our discussion. Thank you.
So I want to start this paper by sketching out the main patterns of anti-Jewish violence and pogroms in Poland at the end of the Second World War. I'll then look at various different historians' attempts to explain that violence. And then finally, I want to look at what happened to Poland's Jews once that wave of violence started to ebb away, which happened basically from around summer 1946 onwards. Now, around 3.5 million Jews lived in Poland before the Second World War, and only around 10% of them survived the Holocaust. Most of them survived by fleeing into the Soviet Union, or they were forcibly deported from Soviet-occupied eastern Poland. So the areas on this map which are marked Soviet Ukraine and Soviet Belarus, tens of thousands of Jews were forcibly deported from that area, and possibly that saved their lives from the Nazi genocide. A small minority also survived on Polish territory, generally with the help of non-Jewish Poles or other non-Jewish locals. And then small numbers also managed to survive long enough in Nazi camps to be rescued by the Soviet troops as they entered Polish territory in 1944 and early 1945. So as the Red Army started to liberate Polish territory in spring and summer 1944, small numbers of surviving Jews came out of their hiding places or out of camps and returned to the towns in which they had lived, towns and villages, to see what was left of them. And very often they encountered non-Jewish Poles living in the homes and businesses which they'd left behind. Faced with a brutal Nazi occupation, many non-Jewish Poles had taken the opportunity to improve their often dire living conditions by taking possession of Jewish homes and Jewish businesses. At first, from spring and summer 1944, many surviving Jews attempted to regain their properties from these non-Jewish Poles. And some Poles responded to those attempts by attacking the Jews. And these conflicts over property formed the backdrop for many of the early attacks on Jews at the end of the Second World War after liberation. But there were also random attacks on Jews in streets and squares, on rural roads, and also many attacks took place on passenger trains. Large-scale attacks also occurred, and it's estimated that at least 15 outright pogroms occurred in the early post-war period, the first 2 years or so after liberation in Poland. Now, the culprits were often ordinary local people. Among them were sometimes low-ranked, poorly trained policemen and soldiers, but a large proportion, perhaps the majority, it's believed, of the culprits were members of armed groups which emerged from Poland's wartime resistance, the resistance movement against the German occupation, and particularly the extreme nationalist resistance group called the National Armed Forces. They carried out a large share of the attacks on Jews in the early post-war period. As I've suggested, the first attacks after liberation happened already in spring and summer 1944, but there were two big surges of anti-Jewish violence in the early post-liberation period in Poland. The first of them happened between March and August 1945, and it culminated in two of the biggest anti-Jewish violent attacks in post-war Poland. So the first of these two major attacks was a bomb attack on Jewish residents of the village near the city of Rzeszów. Rzeszów is in the bottom right-hand corner of this map of post-war Polish territory. And that happened in early August 1945, and it killed around 16 Jews, it's believed. The second big attack in that first surge of violence was the Kraków pogrom, which happened on the 11th of August 1945. And it started with a mob attack on a synagogue. And it killed up to 5 Jews. It's not known, as far as I know, exactly how many Jews were killed. So that was the first big surge of anti-Jewish violence. The second surge started with the Parchev pogrom in February 1946. Parchev on this map, on the right-hand side you see the city of Lublin. It's basically located to the northeast of Lublin. So this pogrom in Parchev sparked this second wave, and that wave culminated with the biggest pogrom in post-war Europe, which happened on the 4th of July 1946. And that was the Kielce pogrom. In the Kielce pogrom, it's a city in central Poland, a Polish mob, together with local policemen and soldiers, shot or beat to death 42 Jews, seriously injuring perhaps 100 others. A huge proportion or a very large proportion of the population of Kielce was involved in that pogrom, but it also, as I say, involved officials, local policemen and soldiers. Like almost all other pogroms which happened in Poland in this period I'm talking about, in 1945, 1946, the Kielce pogrom was sparked by rumours that local Jews were carrying out kidnaps and ritual murders against Christian children. And another important idea which featured prominently in the rhetoric and the nationalist propaganda which surrounded this violence was the claim that all Jews were communists. This was encapsulated by the Polish phrase Żydokomuna. Now, Poland's communist-led government generally responded weakly to the anti-Jewish violence witnessed in Poland at this time. And the same was true of the Kielce pogrom. The Polish government failed to send in forces to stop the attack as it was ongoing. And this clearly had something to do with the communists not wanting to give substance to this Żydo-komuna stereotype by showing themselves to be on the side of the Jews. But the Kielce pogrom received international media attention, and communist leaders could see that a wave of new pogroms was about to kick off in central Poland if they didn't quickly gain control of the situation. So very quickly after the pogrom, 9 individuals were put on trial by the authorities, and they just a week after the pogrom happened, nine of these individuals were executed. Actually, I think it was 13 individuals or so were put on trial, but 9 individuals were executed a week after the pogrom. The communist authorities also staged protest rallies all over or in much of central Poland, condemning the Kielce pogrom, and they sent new forces into Kielce to regain control of the situation in the city. Now, this second big surge of anti-Jewish violence gradually ebbed away in the second half of 1946, and the post-war wave of violence was basically over by 1947. In all, it's estimated that around 1,500 Jews were killed in the whole period, 1944 to 47, although some historians, including the American historian David Engel, puts the figure more at 500. But anyway, it's a large figure. Most of the attacks happened in central Poland, or really within the context of post-war Polish territory. They happened in the southeastern corner of Poland, so in the Kielce voivodeship, the Lublin voivodeship, Kraków and Rzeszów. So that's basically all those regions to the south and southeast of Warsaw. So how do we explain this wave of violence, or 2 big waves of violence in early post-war Poland? Clearly, in each individual attack, a whole diverse range of motives were involved, and often material motives and even personal animosities played a role. But what are the broader factors explaining how it became possible for a large number of Poles to think it was acceptable to attack the survivors of the Nazi genocide? Well, the first thing to say here is that it really isn't. It's really difficult to believe that this wave of anti-Jewish violence would have happened without conditions of very severe poverty and profound social dislocation prevailing in Poland at this time. And similar things, I think, could probably be said of the earlier pogroms that we've heard about in Russia and Poland since the late 19th century. But this merely describes the general context in which anti-Jewish violence occurred. And I want to discuss some more specific reasons for this wave of post-war violence by looking at 4 different explanations given by various historians. Now, the first of these explanations I want to provide is given by nationalist historians, Polish nationalist historians, historians such as Marek Jan Chodkiewicz. These historians, Chodkiewicz and others, believe that Poland's Jews provoked the violence perpetrated against them at this time. Now, the main way they're alleged to have provoked it was by supporting the Soviet occupation of eastern Poland in 1939 to 1941, but also by apparently, allegedly helping the communists to construct their dictatorship in Poland from 1944 onwards. Chodkiewicz claims that the Jews held a disproportionate number of posts in the post-war regime's key institutions, and particularly in the regime's secret police apparatus, the Ministry of Public Security. And he argues that the attacks on Jews in this period were merely part of a much broader struggle by non-Jewish Polish society at this time to prevent a communist dictatorship from being imposed on Poland at the end of the war. In other words, these Polish nationalist historians like Chodorkiewicz embrace this Żydokomuna myth that I'm talking about, the equation of Jews with communists and of communists with Jews. What they say is that it was only because Polish Jews really did help to establish a communist dictatorship in Poland, both in 1939 to 41 and also from 1944 onwards, that they came under attack in the early post-war period. Now, few mainstream historians, whether in Poland or abroad, accept this nationalist claim that most Jews were active communists or were actively involved in the post-war communist regime, in helping to run that government. The American historian who I've already referred to, David Engel, points out as a way to undermine this idea that the surges in attacks on Jews didn't take place in the same areas or at the same times as the surges of attacks by the anti-communist underground on the authorities. They don't match one another, is what David Engel says. So that's the nationalist explanation for this. Now, I'll now turn to a second explanation, which is been provided in a recent book by Marcin Zaremba. This is a Polish book which are translated as Great Fear. Now, Zaremba argues that that a deep-rooted collective anxiety swept across Poland at the end of the war. He argues that this collective anxiety was a result of a number of factors. So, firstly, he says it's down to the profound psychological damage done to Poles by the German occupation. Secondly, he argues that it resulted from a wave of criminality, robbery, and looting, which swept across Poland in the anarchic conditions which came in the wake of the collapse of the German occupation. Thirdly, he argues that it stemmed from the very real threat of starvation and epidemics which large swathes of Polish society were confronting immediately after the German occupation. And Zaremba argues that this profound collective anxiety made Poles very susceptible to unrealistic and mythical beliefs. These included, above all, the myth of Jewish ritual murder of Christian children, but also the Żydokomuna myth, stereotype that Jews are communists and communists are Jews. According to Zaremba, these anti-Semitic myths helped to channel this collective anxiety in the direction of anti-Jewish violence, and this is what explains the anti-Jewish violence which occurred, this collective anxiety at the end of the Second World War. So the third explanation is provided by Jan Gross in his 2006 book, Fear. Now, for Gross, the reason many Poles carried out attacks on Jews after the war stemmed less from contemporary conditions and more from Polish actions during the Nazi occupation. Specifically, Gross argues that wrongdoing by Poles against Jews during the occupation had two important consequences for Poles once the war was over. Firstly, Poles in possession of Jewish properties felt that their material situation was threatened by the return of surviving Jewish owners. And secondly, he argues that the return of Jewish survivors had a profound psychological effect on many Poles in that it drove home to them quite how precarious their lives were when confronted with a powerful totalitarian regime. And he stresses that this was significant because precisely at this time, according to him, a powerful totalitarian regime was being imposed on Poland in these early years after the Second World War. And he argues that the resulting fear meant that many Poles couldn't cope with the presence of Jews in their communities after liberation, and that was behind the attacks on Jews after this, in this period, and I'm talking about in the early post-war years. Now, the final explanation I want to present is put forward by both David Engel and Joanna Miklitz. And they both argue that the post-war attacks on Jews were driven by widespread support for the ethno-nationalist ideology of Poland's national democracy movement. In Polish, it's referred to as endecja. National democracy was enormously influential in Poland in the first half of the 20th century when it was led by an individual called Roman Dmowski. And the long-term objective of national democracy was to create an ethnically homogeneous Polish nation state. And this movement, national democracy, viewed Jews as the main enemy of the Polish nation. Engel and Miklitz both emphasized that Dmowski's ethno-nationalist ideology propelled anti-Jewish violence not only in the early post-war years, but also in the interwar years in Poland. Where these two historians differ is on the question of whether anti-Jewish violence after the war was radically different from the violence of the interwar years. David Engel argues that the post-war violence was more than matched in scope and scale by anti-Jewish violence witnessed in Poland in 1918 and 1919. But Joanna Miklitz rejects this. She argues that the post-war violence was much more brutal and much greater in scale after the Second World War than that witnessed in the interwar years. And I should say that Jan Gross and Marcin Zaremba, who I've referred to, both agree with Miklitz on this, that the early post-war violence was much worse than the interwar violence. So there's significant differences between these various historians, but there's also a good deal of overlapping ideas among them. Only the explanation provided by the nationalist historians like Chodokiewicz really stands out as not sharing much in common with the others. And essentially that nationalist explanation is clearly itself driven by anti-Semitism. So I'll turn very briefly to the consequences of this violence. What happened to Poland's Jews once this wave of violence started to ebb away again? Well, very briefly, I should look again at the broader fate of Poland's Jews in the years 1944 to 46. As I've mentioned already, the vast majority of Jews who survived the Holocaust did so by fleeing or being deported to the Soviet Union. And from the end of 1944 onwards, these survivors were transported back from the Soviet Union, so that by August 1946, around 200,000 Polish Jews had reached Polish territory from the USSR. And these returnees from the Soviet Union formed the vast majority of surviving Polish Jews on Polish territory after the war. Most of them were transported to the new territories of Poland, territories which were handed over from Germany to Poland. They're shaded on the left-hand side here. They were part of Germany until the end of the Second World War. And specifically, the vast majority of them, or the majority of them, were concentrated in the area on the bottom left of this map, marked Lower Silesia. It's not a very clear map, but they were concentrated in one particular area of those new territories. And what you see in 1945 and 1946 is a remarkable renaissance in Polish Jewish life and Yiddish culture in Lower Silesia. In fact, there was a lot of hope in the Polish Jewish community of Lower Silesia in these first 2 years or so after the Second World War. And those hopes were dashed by the Kielce pogrom, which I've spoken about, of July 1946. It unleashed a surge of panic among Poland's Jews. One of the consequences of that is that many of the Polish Jews who had remained in central Poland started to move to Lower Silesia because it was more secure for them there. But another consequence is that there was a wave of mass emigration of Poland's Jews also from the whole of Poland, including from this Lower Silesian community. And this was where the communist leadership's real attitude towards Poland's surviving Jews started to reveal itself. Because from summer 1946 onwards, the communist-led regime started in secret to facilitate the emigration of Jews from Poland. Around 90,000 Jews, bearing in mind only 200,000 Jews had been transported back from the Soviet Union, and a few tens of thousands of others had survived in Polish territory. Around 90,000 Polish Jews emigrated just in the second half of 1946. They mainly travelled to Western DP camps, displaced person camps in Germany, from where they were able to emigrate to Israel and the United States from 1948 onwards. Polish Jews continued to emigrate in the next few years, and it's estimated that only there may have been as few as 60,000 Polish Jews remaining in Poland from the end of 1950 onwards. Now, as I argue, and this is really my concluding point, as I argue in my book, Germans to Poles, the communist regime's willingness to help Polish Jews emigrate after summer 1946 should be viewed as part of its broader campaign of ethnic cleansing after the Second World War. Now, in an effort to win over the majority of Polish society to their new regime, the communists made strategic use of the nationalist ideas and goals of Dmowski's, Roman Dmowski's national democracy movement. As part of this, they actively expelled over 3 million ethnic Germans and around 500,000 ethnic Ukrainians between 1944 and 1948. Now, the communists clearly never considered expelling Polish Jews from Poland, but when the Kielce pogrom triggered a big collective push from a large part of the Polish Jewish community to emigrate from Poland, the regime grasped this opportunity with both hands and began to actively facilitate it. So this was an indirect approach to ethnic cleansing, which together with the active expulsion of Germans and Ukrainians, achieved an objective which is probably in line with the majority of non-Jewish Poles in this period, which basically majority of non-Jewish Polish society supported at this time the creation of a Polish nation state, which was almost free of German, Ukrainian and Jewish residents. Thank you.